So we are back, and with NXT running a major show, I really wanted to talk about the history of the developmental territory as it is accordance to WWE. Because WWE really established how these things are run and how these things are established. Let's talk about the Capital Wrestling Corporation, the CWC, because this one becomes very, very unique. Because this is when you have the transition from the amateur wrestling that, the Carney days happened to the one that Toots Mondt built. And we're going to be talking about Toots Mondt quite a bit because he was really the first pro wrestling trainer of trainers, in a way. So what Capital Wrestling used to do when they were doing this was they would do one or two things. They do like 3 or 4 things, and I'll only talk about a couple of them. They would go to what were called pro wrestling groups. And what those were trainers held a certain roster of people that would contract out for royalties. The biggest one was the Fabulous Moolah and the women's division. That was the biggest pro wrestling group because Moolah controlled all of the stuff back in the 60s. With all of the female wrestlers, she would go to different promoters and say, you can book these people here, these people here, these people here. CWC never owned women's wrestling. It was always Fabulous Moolah or Billy Wolf before her and Mildred Burke. You also had Killer Kowalski, who did something fairly similar, at least to the start of his training days in the 70s when he retired from actual in-ring competition. But the CWC did have, actually, especially early in its days, its own training school because of probably one of the greatest and most influential wrestlers of all time, and that's Toots Mondt, who established that flying bang style of wrestling that actually we know now. That was its predecessor, was this. He was the one who innovated, taking it away from the amateur style more to the theatrical style. So what Toots Mondt did is that he trained not only the first big batch of wrestlers that we know today, actually now, especially with the first golden era of wrestling, but he trained the trainers on how to do these things right. And not only that, but he trained how to do the new rings, because at first it was only on an elevated mat, but he was the one who introduced ropes and turnbuckles after seeing it in Mexico. And Mexico only had like one turnbuckle and one rope at that time. So he trained people like Antonio Rocca, Cowboy Bob Watts, so Bruno Sammartino, who within themselves actually trained everybody else outside of that, like with Billy Robinson, with Fabulous Moolah, actually, to a point. So really, there's an establishment of these trainers within the CWC. Because there really weren't big wrestling schools other than the wrestling groups. But after a while, these wrestling groups, and we talked about Killer Kowalski, who trained people for decades. I mean, he trained people up until, I think, like 2008 when he died. And that school is still open to this day. People like Damian Sandow and Triple H went through Killer Kowalski and his school. And it was just not only them who were trained under Kowalski, but those are just the most well-known people, at least to what you would think is Killer Kowalski students. But what Kowalski would do, which was actually different than everybody else, is that he would take a group of individuals, and he pretty much trained men up until, I think, like the 90s. For the most part. I think there were like some females here and there, but really Kowalski was the male school and Moolah was a female school. He would take these trainees, like the cream of the crop, the top tier, and there was no promotion, so really it was up to Killer Kowalski's preference on who to take to these promoters. and they would do training drills in the promoter's rings. And what he would do, he would sit with the promoter and say, okay, whoever, if you have some people that you want to work with, I want to get these people in front of people. I want to get these wrestlers in front of people to really get some training, even if they're actually jobbers, which actually he was the first one to really kind of innovate that jobber mentality to see how they do in front of people. He would go to them and say, I want you to choose who you work with. And obviously, places like ECW and WWE were more than happy to work with Kowalski on these because it really gave good training. And also, it was cheaper than finding indie stars, especially then. And also, it didn't bury any other talent. So after a while, WWE really wanted a promotion established to actually have a school. And not only that, but really a school training background. But they also were looking at places where the superstars that they really wanted to push to be polished, and also returning superstars getting the ring rust off before they return to television. Right. So this is where the United States Wrestling Association came into town back in the late 80s, early 90s, which was run by Jerry Jarrett and Jerry the King Lawler out of Memphis. So really, this was the first promotion they actually tried this, where they had wrestlers that they really wanted to push, get some additional training, especially from a second-generation wrestler like Jerry Jarrett, or a second-generation booker, like Jerry Jarrett, and then a established legend, even at that time, Jerry the King Lawler, to get additional training.
Right.
With the USWA, you saw people, and also there were talent exchanges. This was the first time when a large talent exchange program happened. They did happen in the Capital Wrestling Corporation and the WWF, but it wasn't like a big established, like a big time thing. It was very much kayfabe, where USWA wrestlers that they really wanted to put on TV went to WWF, especially on Raw and SmackDown as the jobbers, or even as an established, credible person. And then vice versa, where maybe WWF were looking at... So The Rock actually did a lot of work with the USWA to train, and also, even in the 90s, they worked with the USWA. Mankind, or Mick Foley, wrestled under a mask. His first couple of matches under a mask were in the USWA, so he knows how to wrestle in a mask. So that's kind of how that was established. After a while with the USWA, it closed. Let's go to OVW, because this one is actually kind of an interesting history. Jim Cornette wanted to get out of Connecticut. Jim Cornette is a Southern-style wrestling personality. He always has been. He always will be. And despite my disagreements with him, he's still very, very important in my wrestling lesson this evening. He wanted an excuse to still work for the WWF, but get out of Connecticut. Because he was not only a personality up there, but he was a booker. He was part of creative. He wore a lot of hats up there, but he was done with it. So he went to Louisville, where OVW actually was at that time, which was very interesting. And he talked with his friend who was running it. If I am not mistaken, that was Dave Darius or something like that. I could be very wrong. I don't know. My notes are really far away from me. That was my fault. So he went down there to visit him, seeing what they were doing. And OVW did exist. It existed since the mid-'80s, before even they signed a Developmental.
Right.
And Cornette saw this as an opportunity for him to still work for the WWF, but get out of the North. So he brokered a deal where OVW was going to be the exclusive training school and the exclusive, developmental promotion that worked with WWF pretty much exclusively, with some ends and ends there.
Right.
This was actually where the term talent farm came from, was with their promotion with the OVW brand. Obviously, the people that you see around me are some of the established wrestlers that came out of there, but there were a lot more than just your John Cena, Brock Lesnar, Batista, and Randy Orton over there. There was Simon Dean, who wrestled as Nova when from OVW. Shelton Benjamin, Charlie Haas, when Kurt Angle came back from his neck injury, he did some matches in OVW to get the ring rust off. A lot of wrestlers did this, or wrestlers who were trying to get in shape like Rikishi, that gained a ton of weight and WWE was concerned about it. He went to OVW for him to possibly train. It didn't work, but that's kind of where that happened.
Yep.
That establishment went up until I think like 2005.
Yep.
Now I think Al Snow runs OVW as a promotion, and it's totally its own independent thing.
And it's actually a farm territory for Impact Wrestling.
Yes, it is. Let's talk about one that's actually very interesting that kind of flies under the radar because they worked at the same time as OVW, which is Heartland Wrestling Association. What this was, it was a company based out of Cincinnati. So you had a much different market than Ohio in that general vicinity. It's actually very much different. It's kind of a weird split there between Ohio and Iowa.
No, you're talking about between Louisville, which is where OVW is.
Yes, that's right. I'm sorry.
And Cincinnati.
Right. No, I'm sorry.
Ohio, which is where Heartland Wrestling Association was based out of.
Yes. So my brain.
OVW was not in Ohio.
Yes, I totally had a brain fart there. So Heartland Wrestling Association was actually the place where the younger people went for the initial training. So OVW is actually really much more of the graduating class, and Heartland was the one where the new stars went to get the very bare basic training as a part of the training was concerned, like the actual wrestling part. OVW was really more promo and character work, where Heartland had that, but really they focused on your fundamentals. And I think it was Larry Hamilton, who was actually a huge wrestler in the 70s, like Madison Square Garden main eventer, with his brother, was the main trainer of Heartland at that time. Heartland has a sketchy history, so we're not going to go into it too much, but Heartland is really where that was, and that kind of ended at the same time as Ohio Valley, where that happened. So after that, there was like a very brief time when Deep South Wrestling was the exclusive for all of it. So they WWE wanted to put all of the everything, so from new trainees to master classes, all under one roof. Right. Ohio Valley didn't want to do that, and Heartland was being a pain in the ass.
So Deep South initially was its own.
Yes, well, just like
independent.
Yep, Ohio Valley Wrestling was very similar. They were,
but WWE actually bought Deep South Wrestling at the very end.
Yes, but Deep South Wrestling had a lot of struggles. I mean, we can do. I might do a whole wrestling lesson on Deep South.
They were second fiddle to OVW for a long time.
Yes, they were, and they really were jealous about that, and they did some really sketchy business practices. But they were there up until 2006.
Yes,
and that is when
became FCW.
So here's the thing. So FCW was the one where WWE really wanted to do it in-house.
Right, so they consolidated everything in FCW. They ended the relationship with OVW.
And DSW.
Well, Deep South went out of business.
Yes.
WWE bought Deep South, changed it to Florida Championship Wrestling.
And moved everything down to Orlando.
At this point in time, FCW was just a farm promotion exclusively for the WWE. It was owned by the WWE.
Right. And then they just kind of put everything there, and they really invested a lot of time and effort into FCW. They made their own. They actually built the own building where everything was done, from editing to the actual camera works to lighting to even training crew members. So literally FCW was their first crack at big time, done everything at the same time work. They trained referees, they trained announcers, they trained wrestlers, they trained backstage people, they trained producers at FCW. And now, from FCW comes NXT, because NXT...
Another little brand they own called NXT.
Well, here's the thing. With NXT, because NXT was like that reality-based television show for 3 seasons, they wanted to keep that, and FCW, they didn't want to make it so localized. Right. They wanted something that could be put on the road because it was starting to pick up steam as being its own established brand. Right. So that's kind of why they dropped the FCW, the Florida Championship Wrestling stuff, to the NXT, because NXT was more so of that international brand, not Florida Championship Wrestling. And that's kind of where we are. So, I mean, WWE, and I think they kind of are missing the mark on that as a part of recognition, but they really have set a great precedent for not only professional wrestling training, but for everything training, from producing a show to booking a show, because they train bookers as well in NXT and FCW even, to crew, to lighting, to everything. So that's kind of my wrestling lesson there for you. Let me know what you thought. And when we come back, we're talking about, we're going to talk about some NXT TakeOver. All right.